And we're back with part 2 of the Superman Spectacular-athon.
Let's talk about Elseworlds.
Elseworlds.
What's an Elseworlds story?
Elseworlds story is basically alternate universe, non-continuity, kind of just what-if scenarios.
They were originally called what-if stories, I
Oh.
believe, within the DC universe. I think Marvel might still... I actually forget what Marvel calls them. Or in the DC, they had, I think another term that they used most of the time, is actually the main one, was imaginary story, which suggests that the rest of the stories are real. Now, I find that there are a lot of bad Elseworlds stories, that they'll take place in another version of this universe, but the problem is that it'll be something fundamental changes, and all of the people act out of character.
Yeah.
A good Elseworlds story...
And, like, nothing else changes. Like, one thing changes, but that doesn't affect anything else within continuity?
Well, no, or for the most part, it'll be that something happens and then all of the rest of the changes are caused by people acting out of character.
Oh.
I find that a good Elseworlds story is one where the universe fundamentally changes, but everyone stays in character. And I think it's that brings us to probably the best Superman Elseworlds story I've ever read, or even Elseworlds story featuring Superman. Superman Red Sun.
Yep.
The premise can be set up in one sentence, which makes it a really good premise.
Yeah.
What's the premise?
Superman if he landed in the USSR.
Yes. This is Russian Superman.
Soviet Superman.
Soviet Superman, because he actually is from the Ukraine.
Yeah.
This is USSR Superman. It's interesting. I'm not going to get into really the details. I think first the main appeal of this. Why does the book work?
The book works because even though Superman is traditionally representative of truth, justice in the American way, he's still Superman when he's a Soviet, because there's more to the American way than just capitalism. It's it's Superman's kindness, his generosity, his care for all living things. And so how that translates to a communist ideal, which shares a lot of that caring for all things equally type mindset.
That's it. Superman is a populist hero, and he will always be a populist hero in any scenario, in any situation. I mean, Superman can renounce his American citizenship if he wants, because he doesn't actually represent America, he represents people. And I think that it makes a point in this, as he's, even though he's a symbol of the USSR in the story, he doesn't represent the USSR entirely to himself, that he does act for the betterment of everyone.
Yeah.
It's like, and that in that moment they realized that I was not just a hero of my people, but I was a hero for everyone.
Oh yeah, that's another thing. I just want to say this. I had trouble reading this a little, because throughout my whole life I kind of imagined Superman with Tim Daly. Is that who voices him?
He had 2 voice actors in the DC.
Well, like that type of voice. So I went through this story just struggling to imagine Superman with a heavy Russian accent.
I don't actually care what Superman sounds like, so...
But in my mind,
that was easy for me. No, I mean that I can much more easily project. But anyway, in that sense, I think it works really well because this is the kind of story that's an exploration of Superman's character. And it's not in the sort of thing where, and actually I can say that there's no single threat or problem that Superman needs to fight. But, or rather in the sense of a person, in the sense of a material
Well,
thing.
there's Luthor.
There is Luthor, but Luthor
he's never that much of a threat.
He's not so much an antagonist as he is a supporting character. And I think I said before that I don't like those kinds of stories, but at the same time, this is still Superman fighting against a much bigger enemy, which, oddly enough, is bureaucracy. That he's constantly throughout this being raised with slightly different values and being in a very different place. He's trying to figure out how he can improve the world. And he's fighting pretty much, as opposed to something like All-Star Superman, where he's trying to just pretty much do the best that he can, given the circumstances that he's in. He's pretty much trying to overcome everything. That everything and everyone, the Americans, the Russians,
well,
not the Russians,
the
the
biggest
Soviets.
difference in his mindset from this story is that being raised in America, Superman, I think, put a lot of priority in individualism. So because he's now a Soviet hero, he sees everything as a collective. So in this story, Superman's main focus is trying to make the world into one extremely efficient collective. And because he is Superman, and he could do all this extremely well, he eventually decides to just control everything and that's where the main...
Kind of, but then there's a lot of nuance to that. And let's not get into let's not really get into the details of that.
But just
because
the main premise is, well, one of the...
It's not even... I don't think it's even so much that he was off to do, but it's something that he struggles with.
Mm-hmm.
But what I like about it is that this really gets at what Superman struggles with in all of his stories.
Yeah.
One of the main ideas of Superman is that, yes, Superman is a guardian. He is a godlike person charged with protecting humans, but how far does that
There's a lot of
responsibility
niche
go?
in it.
Not entirely. Kind of just through the name Superman,
Mm-hmm.
but I think really the main question is, Superman has the power to protect people. Does he have the responsibility to protect people? And when he acts, is he at any point doing too much or not enough? I mean, Superman, in the main continuity, is not a democratically appointed person. He's just taking it upon himself to do what his vision of right is for people. And people sometimes, they always will appreciate that, but then that creates problems. I think this is just another version of the universe that explores those problems. And I could go on all day talking about what I like about the book in general, because again, it does bring in a lot of other characters and a lot of points of the universe, but this isn't really so much, I think, about this book as it is about how this acts as a Superman story. So I think in that sense, it works very well. And would you like to show what it looks like?
I just want to show off a couple panels. This is from the middle of the book, but I don't think it's really spoiling anything.
It's not showing anything.
Yeah. But here's a good panel. Here's my favorite panel in the whole book. Splash page. Yours is... I'll find yours. I know where it is.
I just think that it's an image that sums up... It's much earlier than that. I can find it.
No, I got it.
He's got it.
Here it is.
It's this one image of, I just think, the extreme benevolence of Superman is something that it's easy to take for granted. It's just that, yeah, alright. This from the beginning. So it's just, yeah, alright, Superman, he's the guy who protects Metropolis, so what? He's protecting them, big deal. This is Superman traveling halfway across the world to save a child in a country that's trying to destroy him. I think that really just embodies
and just the
spirit.
The caption here. Not the caption, but it's fuzzy. It says, they realized I was here to save them.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at before, and I think that works really well. And also, just as a book, the style is kind of reminiscent of Soviet artwork from that period, although also very much blended with various traditional comics artists. So, is there anything else we want to say about this, or can we move on? I mean, I don't really want to get into... There's a lot I could say about the book in general, but I don't really want to get into, like, plot and really why I just like it as a book, as opposed to a Superman story.
Out of all of the comics we're going to mention in this discussion, this is my favorite of them. I think that it has a really good premise, that it builds really well, and that just everything in the story is so detailed and so just finely crafted and well put together that it's just really, really good.
It's my favorite too. I just think that it is an Elseworld story, though, so it is getting away from the reality of Superman to explore the idea of Superman. So I think that's something that, if you're interested in, it's definitely worth exploring, although it also might not be for every person.
Yeah.
And moving on, before we get to the last major arc that we want to talk about, I'm just going to mention that as far as a starting point goes, if by any chance you haven't actually taken a look at Morrison's run currently on Action Comics,
that's
by
a
all
great
means
place to start.
I think, I'm not going to say it's the best Superman arc, but I think that as starting point, and I think that was the idea, was a jumping on point for people. I think that really does a very good job of compressing a lot of the Superman mythos and a lot of the Superman idea into a very small space. So if that's one of your concerns, that you don't want to, that you want to get something that's going to give you the full overall effect without taking a lot of time, even if it's not perhaps the best story, it's still a very good one. But if it's not perhaps the best story, then that's something that's definitely worth looking at. Although at the same time, it's not in trade form yet, so that would
I think
cost
it will
some
be
money.
next month. They're going to release like the trades of all the first 7 or something issues.
I don't think it's actually. It's in the comics that it's But moving on to, this is one that Noah again disagrees with me. In this case, it's something that I like and that Noah hasn't read.
Yeah.
And unfortunately that I don't have in front of me. it's kind of hard to talk about significant events in the past of Superman without talking about one. Because really, a lot of Superman's past runs together.
Mm-hmm.
Not that there are bad arcs within them, or that it's boring or monotonous, but that it's hard to find like a definitive event that marks Superman history. I mean, there are, or a particular arc that really marks a turning point in how Superman is written or how we understand Superman. For Batman, you could do that. For most characters, you could do that. Superman, not so much, except perhaps one. And that is...
You say.
It's the death of Superman. Spoiler alert.
But I think we should preface this. This is only talking about the death, which is the first part of a even more long-running thing called The Death and Return of Superman. Now, all I know from this arc comes from this one video you can find on YouTube called The Death and Return of Superman, the movie.
I think this is great. I love this, that it's an internet commentator learning his stuff from
an internet
commentator.
And like the Wikipedia page,
I'm not going
TV page and stuff.
Whatever his sources are, I am not going to advocate on behalf of because I'm not familiar with it.
But I will. Now, what that video I mentioned is mostly about the return part, and that's where it gets really silly. So I'm just gonna let him talk about the death of Superman now.
Yeah, the return part I don't even really care about. Just with regards to this video, because I think the significant story is the death of Superman. Now, this was a major crossover. I mean, this was not just something that happened in the Superman arc. This was an event. So first off, it's nearly impossible to read everything that is engaged, not engaged, but everything that's involved, because there's so much stuff that is from all different sources that hasn't been compiled. I mean, there's Death of Superman. Funeral for a Friend is another really big thing that crosses over so much. And even in random things that aren't even about Superman, you would have at that time people wearing the Superman armband.
Yeah.
All of that. It was a major event, but beyond that...
It was an event outside of comics, too. Like, there's people on the news in real life reporting DC has killed off Superman.
No, I'm sorry, but that is probably, in terms of just things happening in comics, that was probably the most significant, newsworthy event in the history of at least DC Comics.
Yeah.
I'm sorry if it was. Because Superman is an American icon. He's not just a comic book icon. It's a cultural icon for people pretty much from all sorts of places. And I'm not going to get into that. No. This isn't me talking about the death of Superman as a story. This is me talking about the death of Superman as a Superman story. Death of Superman, as it's compiled into trade, just leading up to his actual death, very simple, very straightforward story. Doomsday, this big killing machine, person, monster, alien, thing, arrives on planet Earth, starts tearing everything up and killing everyone. Superman tries to stop it. Superman fights him. Superman dies. Spoiler alert, but it's called The Death of Superman, so I don't think that's really giving away much. That's the story. Very simple, very straightforward, very well executed. And I am shocked that I'm saying this still, because before I read it, I didn't expect much from it. And I'm sure a lot of people won't get much from it, because it kind of but it kind of plays into all of those problems that we talked about. There's this whole idea of, if you want to write a good Superman story, you give him an interesting enemy to fight. Give him, like, an interesting character to engage with. And make it not just something that, it's a monster and he needs to destroy it. If you have something,
Doomsday is.
Yeah, that if you give him a one-dimensional enemy, then you're going to get a one-dimensional story. So what you need to do is make an interesting enemy. Death of Superman doesn't do that. There's the whole subject of, it's about Superman questioning his role and his responsibility. It's the ethics of Superman. It's, should there be a Superman? What is Superman's role? How should Superman act as Red Son?
Superman's just beating up Doomsday.
And this is indisputably the right thing to do. There's no ethical questions here. There are no qualms here of that nature. And in terms of All-Star Superman, what was the main appeal of that?
The main appeal of All-Star Superman was that there really was nothing to keep Superman from being this all-powerful person.
It's the question of what can Superman do with his powers given the opportunity. That what is Superman truly capable of, and how can that affect our world, and what are the consequences of that? this is almost the opposite of this. Superman can't even kill Doomsday without dying.
What a failure.
That's it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, this is the one story that shows us that Superman can fail. This is the one story that pretty much goes contrary to everything that we've come to assume about Superman and everything that sets our expectations for Superman. Now, you could argue that bringing him back after this kind of invalidates that.
And that's my big problem with the whole thing.
And I'm not going to talk about that
because that's not part of the death.
because I'm just talking about the death of Superman. So my feelings about that are separate. But at the same time, and also at the same time, you could say, oh, it's a gimmick. That killing Superman, yeah, sure.
Just to race it.
Sure, you create something that is definitively the only thing that can kill Superman, and then it kills Superman. What's the big deal?
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like professional wrestling. And this really, he's going to roll his eyes. When I was reading this, I felt like I was almost watching a professional wrestling match, just in the way that it's set up.
And that Doomsday wears these little green underwear things.
As does Superman.
No.
It's actually a full suit that gets torn off him as he goes. For the first 3 issues, Superman is literally, he fights off the entire Justice League with one arm tied behind his back. Literally. Not the same Justice League that you'd think of, the 80s Justice League, though. Yeah. It was weird.
Also, he fights people like Guardian, or whatever his name, the guy with the shield.
Yeah, Guardian.
Yeah.
It was the 80s. He fights different dimension Supergirl who's dating Australian bearded Lex Luthor. The 80s were stranger than people give it credit for. Anyway, back onto topic. It's that Superman has been established as being so strong and being so not destructive, but powerful and invincible, that it's very hard to say, oh, this is a character who can legitimately defeat Superman and make it seem not cheap and make it not seem contrived. And when you say, oh, this is just this monster whose only powers are invulnerability, and that he's super strong, he's super fast, and he can jump really high, you could say that's a really contrived idea. That's Superman.
But what is Superman?
Doomsday is, in terms of his power set, the original Superman. Like from the original Superman comics, going back to Action Comics #1. Before Superman could fly, before he had ice breath and heat
Stronger
vision,
than a locomotive, faster than a speeding bullet.
able to leap tall buildings in a single bound. So really, it's the quintessential immovable object meets the unstoppable force story.
Well, they're both unstoppable force.
You know what I mean. That's how the saying goes. It's that quintessential kind of story. And fundamentally, it's not introducing anything or any sort of abilities or powers that don't already exist in the Superman, in the DC universe. That Superman don't already exist in this world because of what Superman himself is capable of. It's not Superman versus Superman in the sense that this is something that behaves entirely differently and has entirely different motives. It's not Superman versus Bizarro. It's not anything like that. It's just power versus power. And the thing is that in terms
It's not
of...
even Superman versus Darkseid.
Darkseid's entirely different. Yeah, as far as I'm concerned. So for the most part, just in terms of seeing a fair fight and how it would reasonably result, it takes 7 issues. I'm not going to say it's the greatest fight sequence I've ever read, but it's one of the ones that, when it gets to the end, and it does build to an enormous climax, done really well.
Oh gee, I wonder what happens.
That's it. It doesn't even matter if you know what happens. It's one of those rare stories where that's the case. But it's essentially saying, here's an impossible thing, show it to me and make it seem real. And it works. That by the time we get to the end, the fight is convincing. And the fight feels real. And because of that, it's probably the most well-written Superman battle, just in terms of battle, that I've ever read. Not that it's ever been written, but that I can remember reading. And that definitely, I think, makes it worth checking out. Again, not talking about the greater implications, but just in terms of Superman fighting, which is the definitive thing that Superman does. I'm sorry, but that's... beyond what he stands for, beyond what he represents, in terms of what he does, he fights. This is the Superman fight. So, again, that's not an aspect
Ding, 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 fight of the century.
This isn't the aspect of Superman that everyone's going to be interested in, but I certainly think there's value to it, and I certainly think it's worth checking out. Not even my favorite Superman story, but for that reason, I think it's very exemplary. Oh, and the art is friggin' amazing.
Yeah, he showed me some of the panels.
Just really well done in terms of, even just in terms of showing action and how things go. And not even so much in creating mood, but just in terms of giving us a sequence of events, essentially sequential art done at its best. There are some downsides, one of which is that because of the way the writing was at the time, people think in thought bubbles, so there's a lot of exposition and narration and soliloquy like that. It's kind of annoying. But for the most part, the battle is shown in a way that works really well and is drawn effectively, because really that's what carries the story, is the visual element to it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the main storyteller, and I think that just makes it another good example of a comic book. So, that pretty much brings us to the end of ones that we wanted to look at. We've only really talked about 4, but I think they're 4 very distinct stories that do very distinct things and are worth perhaps exploring. And then the thing is that if you do take interest in any of these, you can
read
explore
more
after that. I mean, there's, for example, Grant. Also, I think looking at writers and their approaches, Grant Morrison did All-Star Superman. He's writing the current Superman, so you could follow that if you like the Grant Morrison Superman.
And then there's
Jeff Johns, his Superman goes on to New Krypton and all those stories.
And now he's writing Justice League.
Yes, well, that's a different story, though.
But Superman's
Dan Jurgens, who wrote, or was one of the main writers behind Death of Superman, because they had different writers there, he's writing the current Superman, so that might be something that you'd want to follow if you find out that. He just started, by the way.
And of course, we didn't talk about some of the other big ones, whatever happened to the Man of Steel.
Man of
Tomorrow pops into my head. So there's plenty more Superman if you...
For the Man Who Has Everything is another one that stands out.
Mm-hmm.
Those we don't really have as... we wouldn't really feel comfortable approaching at this point, so we're not really going to talk about those. At the same time, though, they're titles you might want to consider.
Mm-hmm. So, there's plenty of Superman out there if you want to experience it all. A lot of it is very nuanced.
Yes.
And, of course, different.
And be sure that we have plenty more to talk about on related subjects, and we will be back very shortly to talk about those.
Yeah. And we might talk about some current comics again, too, if we're up to it.